You want me to try to answer the question about DRC and how to handle that situation, perhaps? I think that's such an important question right now. Of course, we have genocidal actions occurring there, and I think that the questioner was quite right that right now the mechanisms are not in place to really address this. If the Security Council tried to act there, my guess is there would be vetoes. And not only that, uh, I don't know whether you could find countries that would be willing to intervene. As you know, the Democratic Republic of Congo asked that the UN peacekeeping mission in there be withdrawn. And uh, it's in other words, it's going to be hard to do politically. Um, that is why, for me at least, the most effective way to prevent genocide, to stop these kinds of conflicts, is regional organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy. Sometimes the regional organizations aren't the ones that everybody thinks about. One would be, of course, the African Union, but the African Union became, in fact, involved in Sudan in UNAMID at the urging of the UN. The UN force was created, and then AU committed the troops. Uh, but I mean, through nation states. Remember always that the member states of the United Nations are nation states. So regional organizations themselves uh, act through their nation states if you want to get troops, for instance. So um, the question then is, what do you do about DRC? Because there you've got two definite nation states directly involved. Well, three really. You've got Uganda, you've got Rwanda, and you've got the DRC. And I add Burundi. And the regional area is in other words pretty big. So you don't want it to devolve into the kind of civil war we had between 1996, and the end of the century, when probably 3 million people were killed. And it was like they call it the World War of Africa. Uh, we can't let it develop into that again. And so my own view is that uh, the African countries who are in the immediate region need to come to diplomatic agreements about how these problems need to be resolved. And all the mechanisms that Professor Packer was talking about that are short of military intervention need to be used here. And the UN, in fact, is set up for that. So I would urge that to be it should be an activist role for the United Nations. The Secretary General should be involved, the Office for the Prevention of Genocide, uh, to get these leaders from these countries together to say, look, we've got to stop this war. And I think in particular of President Kagame of Rwanda and President Tshisekedi of DRC in particular, but also President Museveni in Uganda. They got to sit down and sort this thing out and try to stop these militia groups. There's over 100 militia groups in eastern DRC right now that are committing mass murders. And they have to be defeated. And the UN wasn't able to. So the question was, I think the question is basically these countries have got to get together and say, okay, we're going to stop this. And it is going to take a unified effort. So first of all, you got to get Tshisekedi and Kagame to talk to each other. Uh, I think that's quite possible. I know President Kagame personally. I know him to be a very reasonable person and actually a very committed person to the future of peace in that region. He's also, I think, a guy who can think outside the box. I think he'd be willing to think about how they could stop some of these genocides in Africa. Uh, they have been, for instance, willing to intercede in Mozambique at the request of the Mozambique government to stop a genocide that was committed by a branch of ISIS in eastern Mozambique. And, that's the kind of thing that could be possible. So I don't have an easy answer here. It would depend on, I think, a lot of diplomacy. I guess that's a diplomat's answer, but I also believe sometimes you need to use force if you're going to, in fact, often you have to use force to stop genocides.
First answer.
I'll be quick.
Yeah, just use the benefit of the microphone. So a couple of things to say. First of all, it's inspiring to hear always Dr. Stanton. And, I teach my students that the two most important elements in their professional prospective career are persistence and creativity, which we don't necessarily teach, actually. And so my shorter answer is you have to take up all of these opportunities, mechanisms, and you have to be innovative. So, for example, with regard to Afghanistan, there is now an effort to reinterpret the prohibition on apartheid. So there's a convention that makes apartheid illegal and criminal. But it's so far been defined, limited to essentially racial definition. And there's a very, I think, compelling argument being made right now that what's happening in Afghanistan targeting women is what is being called gender apartheid, that it's a different rationale or target, but the essence is the same of racist apartheid, the South African archetype. I think that's pretty compelling when you look at the situation, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to widen the aperture of the norm to address this phenomenon, which is kind of, I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's pretty bizarre in what's going on in Afghanistan. This kind of extreme systematic attack against a gender as such. But I would go further and say, for example, we do have a mechanism, the Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide of the United Nations, that now works very closely also with another office. In fact, the two are joined together in the Office of the Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect. So Dr. Stanton mentioned the responsibility to protect. I think this is a very useful thing, because if you put the two together, then we a little bit escape this preoccupation with the precision. Is it really genocide? Is it really not genocide? When do we call it genocide? Well, it might not be genocide yet, but it has all the other elements that you want to address it on. And as Dr. Stanton said, the kind of political accord from 2005, from the outcome document of the summit of 2005, endorses the responsibility to protect. So if you put that together, then we can be a little bit more kind of creative and responsive to the underlying objectives. I would also say that, by the way, with regard to the situation today, this question about intensity and so forth, this is a subject which has some significance in, for example, international humanitarian law. And there are, without getting into details, there's a whole other set of criminal culpability for individuals under humanitarian law, war crimes. So which undoubtedly apply. But the duty to prevent in genocide is a specific articulated obligation. So it's helpful if you're trying to mobilize states to act. If it is genocide or has a serious risk of, I didn't read out for you because time was short, but the International Court of Justice has already said, how do we know when the duty to prevent begins? The court has said it's at the moment that a state knows or ought reasonably to know that there is a serious risk of genocide. That's pretty far down before. So you don't need a single person killed. You don't need even a lot of other bad activities. In a case like Tigray, in my own opinion, and some of you know I have advised on this, we have long ago passed not only the prevention of genocide threshold, we're well into genocide in my view and the view of many other people. It does matter, this kind of recognition, because this kind of attribution of duties and how to mobilize the will. Of course, states, like Dr. Stanton said, they are self-interested in avoiding that responsibility and trying not to be. There are some people now raising a question in Canada whether Canada's participation in certain ongoing situations has surpassed or violated the duty to prevent. For example, provision of weapons and things like that. So my view is it's very good to have those things assessed and adjudicated because we would like them objectively adjudicated with the application of law under scrutiny of legal obligations. So I would say the more the better. It's not a bad thing to have these things. It's actually a better thing. And the more that people see that they're operating. So for example, just to give a couple of quick examples, the implication for Canada of the situation in Cameroon or situations in Cameroon, where it would be very interesting to know with it directly affects Canada. We have an embassy there. We have some trade relations, but we also have significant diasporas on both or all sides of the conflicts. It would be very helpful if there was some institution who could kind of parse this out and identify where we are, what it means for Canada, and therefore what we should be doing and what we should not be doing, right? So I think the same could be said right now with regard to Israel-Palestine, with regard to Ukraine-Russia. And there's a lot here which is overtly political and is obstructing action which contributes to a legal and a just approach which has foreseeability and has effectiveness. So I'm in favor of those, and what I would say is we can mobilize. We can ask our politicians why we don't respond, why we don't have institutions. If they say, if only we knew, we'll tell them bullshit. If they say it's too costly, well, so what do you mean? We're a G7 state with a couple $1 trillion GDP. If they say we don't have experts, bullshit. We got a lot of people who know a lot about this stuff, right? So this idea, we can't, we're constrained, it's too difficult. If only we knew, if only we could, if only there was, blue sky every day of the year. This has to stop, and we need to just be more demanding. Thank you.